I am Gloria Godson. Thank you for joining us today. We are kicking off our Racial Equity and Unity discussion series today. Last year, we had weekly conversations on these same issues for several months, and many of you partnered with us. You engaged with us, you asked us questions, and we heard from you. We heard that these discussions were meaningful to you, that it brought healing, and that for many of you, it was very eye-opening. Well, today, our nation is more divided than ever before. The Church of Jesus Christ is the only body that has a solution to the problem. We cannot wait. We cannot wait for another racial incident. We cannot wait for the media to begin to talk about this again, because usually when they do is when something has gone terribly wrong. And you know what? We cannot wait for the world to use their weapons, because their weapons are filled with hate and destruction. We have to use our weapons, the weapons that Jesus gave to us, the weapons of love and patience and goodness and mercy. That's what these discussions are all about today. So we invite you to engage with us again, ask questions again, converse with us, speak to us, and partner with us. Let's join hands together to heal the soul of America. Only the church, you and I, can do this. My guests today are properly, powerfully equipped to engage in this discussion today. Our topic is the origins and evolution of the U.S. race problem. Aaron Enzer is a military and foreign policy historian. He is also a paralegal with over 20 years of experience in electronic discovery, litigation, bankruptcy, and much more. He is also an instructor at Wilmington University and has personal experience dealing with racism when he lived in Alabama. Dr. Daryl Jones is no stranger to the Grace Talk. He is the associate pastor at New Destiny Fellowship Church in Wilmington, and he's the founder of Emmanuel Assembly Bible Academy. Dr. Daryl has 2 master's degrees and a PhD degree, and very well involved in these discussions, as well as you guys are going to hear today. So Aaron and Daryl, welcome to the Grace Talk.
Glad to be here.
Right, so I am going to kick off with a quick discussion of the vision and the mission of this new initiative that we're embarking on, this new series of discussions. We want to educate, to engage, and to advocate on issues of racial equity and unity, and to promote reconciliation and healing. That's really the thrust of everything we're doing, is to promote reconciliation and healing, starting from the church. Because if the church is not united, nobody else can do it. Starting from the church and then going outward. We want to engage our community, meaning you listening to us today, in honest and candid dialogue about race. We want to build understanding and empathy. We want to disrupt wrong patterns of thought and structures that have been long-standing structures that need to give way for the new things that God wants to do. We want to build bridges, and we want to build strategic partnerships across racial lines, like what you're seeing here today, Aaron and Daryl, because that's the only way that we can make this happen. We want to promote joint accountability for change. It is not up to one ethnic group or one race to make change. We have to do it together in unity, and we have to commit to lifelong learning about racial equity and unity. That's the only way that this is going to work. And that's the thrust of our discussion today. And that's why we're here. The scriptures that form the basis of this initiative is Ephesians chapter 2 from verse 14 to 16 in the Passion Translation, and then Acts chapter 17, verse 26. I think many of us are very familiar with these scriptures, telling us that God made us all from one race of humanity, one blood, and also that in Christ, ethnic hatred died. He tore it down. and he had rebuilt one race of humanity, and that's where we are. Well, with that out of the way now, I'm going to dive into our conversation today. And we're going to devote the entire time to understanding where we came from, where we are today, and by the grace of God, how we can get to the place that I truly believe in my heart that God wants us to get to, a place of unity, reconciliation, and healing. Aaron, why don't you kick us off? Tell our audience a little bit about your background and what you bring to this discussion, and then talk to us about the origins of the race problem in the US.
Yeah, thanks, Gloria. So I have a varied background in this. I did get a master's degree in history, and I focused a lot on the British Empire in particular, and that involved the slave trade. At a certain point, Britain, once they had jettisoned it, they actually went after the slave trade internationally. So I have that academic background. I also have spent the last almost 25 years in litigation. And with that, I have encountered a number of different civil rights issues and cases, especially involving large-scale civil rights issues such as environmental trespass and other types of civil rights issues. But I've experienced this personally. When I was going to college in Alabama, I was a manager at the local McDonald's, and I was disciplined for hiring 2 people of color. And there were several other incidences I could spend a lot of time talking about, but I guess that they assumed that because of the way I looked that I was on their team. And so I got a lot of insight because they shared stuff with me. So I got a lot of insight of where they were coming from. So I have quite a different perspective growing up in the North than going to the South and seeing the variety of racism that reared its ugly head. So I want to look back at the origin of racism, which is tied to slavery in the United States. So to try to make an extremely long story short, most of the colonies were founded to make money. And the fact the Virginia colony was founded by stockholders. Their goal was to make money, not found a utopia or anything like that. There were other colonies that people did try to set up to express their own religious freedoms. But many of the colonies were set up simply to make money. Now, in order to do that, they needed a labor source. And the natives that they ran into weren't very keen on that. And so they had to get people over here. And this was a long journey. This is a 3-month journey by ship. There was no guarantee you're going to survive the journey. And why would you leave England to do that? So they developed the indentured servant program, which allowed for you to come over here. They would pay for your passage by working for them for 7 years. Well, that quickly turned into a problem because, one, the labor source wasn't enough. They needed more. And secondly, we have a lot of writings from the time that shows that the planters saw these indentured servants as potential competitors. So they had to restructure this, and there had been a slave system already set up in the Caribbean, and that was the importation of African slaves. And so while there's a lot of controversy around that 1619 arrival, they were listed as indentured servants, yes, and we don't know a whole lot about what happened, but by the 1630s, you now had a legal system that was now supporting the idea of enslaving the Africans, or what they call the Negro Africans. And in order to do this, so in order to enslave an entire race of people, they had to find a way to justify it. Okay, because this is not like slavery of the ancient world. Slavery in the ancient world, slaves had rights. They could be free. Once free, they were an equal part of society. That's not what was happening here. So we had to find a way to justify it. And unfortunately, the Christian church found ways to justify it. They used the scriptures in order to justify this type of structure. And so we all talk about, institutional racism. We talk about, systemic racism. We know there's individual racists, obviously, but one thing that's not talked a lot about is societal racism. And that is when society, you don't have to be a personal racist yourself, but if you sit by and allow it to happen, that's how institutional systemic racism is allowed to survive, because you have to give consent to that. And so society, which was in the colonies very much built around the church, whatever church was established here, either Church of England, the Puritans, Quakers, whatever, you had a religious structure that structured the society. And so we basically, while we were trying to leave the structure we had in England, which ironically, since the days of William the Conqueror, slavery was not a part of the law. You could not enslave your fellow citizen. Now, if you owed a debt, if you committed a crime, then yes, you could do that, but that was not perpetual. Your kids were not thrown into it. It was a very different legal system. So they structured a society, particularly, now all the colonies, the North is not innocent, all the colonies had slaves to some degree. But it really developed in the cash crops in the South, particularly with tobacco, later with rice and cotton and various things. That's really where it thrived. And in order to keep a large group of people in this bondage, they had this strict societal structure. And so they were viewed as inferior. And some even justified that, well, now we can give them the gospel because we pulled them out of their heathen Africa, so that they even justified it on that grounds. Others believed they didn't even have a soul, and so therefore they weren't really human. So it fell on a variety of spectrum. But in general, this societal structure then became permanent. And then there were issues where some slaves didn't want to tolerate slavery. They felt that they should not be in that position. And so there were threats that the slaveholding class felt. So they had to clamp down on the law. They had to make it tighter. They had to have complete segregation. And unfortunately, the church was one of the most segregated places. In several areas, either the slaves had to sit in a separate section, or they had to have their whole separate church to themselves. So this system set in place, and even at the time of the Revolution, where we're talking about freedom, where we're talking about liberty and justice, we were excluding an entire group of people. And so when we went to compromise, most of the northern colonies were shedding slavery. The last state was New Jersey in 1804. So that's still in the early part of the country. So they didn't want the country to fall apart over this issue. So they made things like the 3/5 compromise, which meant a slave counted as 3/5 of a person. But slavery was not an explicit right in the Constitution, but it was definitely an implied right. And it was there. And so it later became a political issue because of the slaveholding states had their perspective and the free states had theirs. And it sort of became a regional battle. And to make a long story short, we got to the point where I think that the real key to understanding the attitudes of race in the early part of the country goes to the Dred Scott decision. That was a Supreme Court decision. It's 54 pages long. I would really suggest, if you want to understand, to take a look at that. I want to read just a tiny section of that. Again, it's 54 pages long, but just a small section where Justice Taney, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, referring to the Negro African race here, okay? They had, for more than a century before, been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. He was bought and sold and treated as an ordinary article of merchandise and traffic whenever a profit could be made by it. This opinion was at the time fixed and universal in the civilized portion of the white race. It was regarded as an axiom in morals as well as in politics, and here's the really important part, which no one thought of disputing or supposed to be open to dispute, and men in every grade and position in society daily and habitually acted upon it in their private pursuits, as well as in matters of public concern, without doubting for a moment the correctness of the opinion. Now that sounds like that's out of the Aryan race or the Nazi Party propaganda or something like that. This is the Supreme Court of the United States saying that we're all racist. We believe we're superior to an entire race of people. There's no dispute. Nobody's arguing it. Nobody's making a point of it. But I think it's interesting that he says that we all do it in our personal lives, that this is an attitude that we all have, and that this is something that nobody is speaking against. Now, fortunately, with the Dred Scott decision, that led to basically the undoing of slavery, because people saw, wait a minute, this is way over the line here. And there was a good rebuttal in one of the dissenting opinions where they described it as atrocious, wicked, abominable, and false. So there were people that were stepping up against it. And then, of course, it was abolished with the Civil War. But that is I think that sums up the attitude of society, that whether you were personally a racist, again, most people in this country never even saw a person of color. Vast areas of the nation had nobody of color. They didn't understand what the issue was. But when they hear this, that puts it into a perspective. And so that is where I point to as a good definition of the societal attitudes that pervaded even well into today.
Thank you, Aaron. I wrote that down. It's atrocious, wicked, abominable, and false. But unfortunately, that was the minority opinion. That was the dissenting opinion, and the majority opinion. One of the things that interested me listening to you read that dicta there is the fact that the judge, the Supreme Court justice, said that that this manner of behavior towards Black people was integrated and a part of everyday life, and that people acted on it in their businesses. It was kind of the framework and the basis upon which people conducted business. People had their individual lives, and that this was not, to the point that you made, questioned or even challenged in any way. And it became the framework, the backdrop, the basis upon which life happened on a day-to-day basis. So life was built upon this atrocious understanding and treatment of people of color. Dr. Jones, do you want to chime in there? You have any thoughts around that?
I do. I think what's really important for us to see here, what Aaron laid out for us and talking about the Dred Scott case, what we need to see is that slavery then set in stone a power imbalance between Blacks and whites, also some a world view about Blacks being inferior and so forth. We have to remember that they were not counted as human beings. I think Aaron touched on that, but were regarded as property, no better than a piece of furniture or an animal that was owned. And so now something gets set in stone here, a kind of power imbalance, a kind of thinking that we have yet to overcome. We're still dealing with this kind of power imbalance and thinking. And people say, well, why do you keep going back to slavery? I had nothing to do with it. But if we're going to understand the present race problem, we have to go back to this point to see where the problem began and where the power imbalance that we're still trying to fight through to come to a more perfect union, a society where there is equality and love between neighbor. We have to see where the problem began, what is holding it in place. And I think what Aaron did was begin to lay out for us what that problem is from the very start. There's been this great divide, this great power imbalance between white and black. And we had the government and the Supreme Court and the church. This is why we talk about institutional racism, systemic racism, just built in the very fabric of what this United States became in its founding. So there's the problem in front of us, where it started, and it's been a fight down through our history to change that power dynamic.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. I actually have a personal story. I went to Charleston, South Carolina, and I visited a place called Boone Plantation. And it was very harrowing. It was a harrowing experience for me. Again, I don't have slavery ancestry. I wasn't born in this country. So I didn't know I was quote unquote Black until I came to the United States. And I went to this Boone Plantation, and it was an extremely horrendous experience for me because I saw books where Black people were recorded, the births were recorded with the same places where they recorded animal births, like horses and in the barns and stuff like that. So that was where the recordation of human being births were recorded, because they were being bred like animals. And I walked into some of the places where the slave quarters, and it was, I was chilled to the bone. Funny enough, I was the only person of color who was there was a business trip, and my colleagues, all my white colleagues, came over to me to ask me if I was okay. I had to leave the place. And they saw very clearly that it had a tremendous impact on them. And they imagined the impact it would have on me. And they came over to ask me several times if I was okay, and I had to leave the place. And I can't even imagine how any human being can see that and somehow justify that that was right, that that was good. Another thing, going back, and some of the things I'm sharing are very hard for me. Many of these things I've never shared publicly. Another thing that Aaron mentioned is kind of, going back, took my mind back. If you've gone to places in Ghana, particularly where the slave trade has, began and where the people went through, there was a station where the women were hosed down. They were hosed down with water so that they were clean enough to be raped. And when just on top of that station is a church. And if you went there as a Christian, you wondered, these people who did this, they're Christians, they go to church. Just on top of the raping station is a church. And you wondered, which God do they serve? Is it the same God that I serve, or is it a different God? The reason I'm saying these things is that, they're very hard to say. It's very hard for me to say these things publicly. It's very hard for me to admit them personally. But we have to go to the beginning to talk about these issues. I don't like to talk about it. It makes me uncomfortable. And I'm sure it makes people who are listening to us uncomfortable. But until we're able to, be willing not to paper over these issues and to have an honest conversation about it and open those wounds so that we can truly bring healing. Our nation is more divided than ever. Covering these things up don't solve the problem. It's opening it up and letting the light and the love of God get in there that would help us. Let's check in with our audience and see what would the comments that we have. Lola, hi Lola. Lola says, indeed, no human being should be owned by other human beings because of the color of their skin or to be used and abused for free labor. And yes, Lola, I think I guess would agree with you. Dr. Okwaku, Pastor Okwaku says, facts, Aaron, yes. Societal racism is still with us.
Okay.
We have a work to do. So let's talk about it, Aaron. Where are those vestiges still of societal racism? You talked about that framework that really was the underpinning of society, and that people conducted business based on that understanding that this set of people were inferior, and so it was okay to, and the opinion said that they had no rights, that any white man was required, white person was required to honor or respect or obey. So obviously they were treated and bought and sold and treated like animals. This is the basis and the framework upon which commerce was conducted, life was conducted. So talk to us, what are those vestiges and where are we now from there?
Yeah, I would like to say that that's an antiquated attitude, but unfortunately, it's not. We see it pervasive in society today. That you can watch. You know, how many examples have we had of police using excessive force on a person of color? I just posted just the other day. It came to my attention. There was a lieutenant in the U.S. Army in full uniform, pulled over by police. They treated him as a felon. They yanked him out of his vehicle. They said, he said, I'm afraid to get out of my vehicle. And the police officer holding the gun to his face said, you ought to be. And how we can see this stuff. And when we saw the riots last year, okay, the protests that turned into riots, where we saw societal racism is everybody was criticizing the rioters and not what caused the frustration. I don't condone that activity, but I don't condone what caused it. If you don't understand the anger, the frustration, that has been held down for so many centuries, even that you can't empathize with another human being on that, and all you're concerned about is, oh, well, they're looting stores, and there's a reason for that. We had the case in Georgia. What last year was, to me, one of the worst out of that whole set, where you had two white men chase down a black man and shoot him in the street. He was unarmed, and when you listen to the 911 calls, all they refer to as, there's a black man, I shot a black man. 911 operator saying, well, what did he do wrong? There's no answer to that. And then a third guy films it and puts it on social media because he thinks that will clear it up. That he did it. He honestly thought then we would understand why this man was shot. That is a lynching, 100%. There's no way around it. They decided this man is guilty of a crime and we're going to kill him. They had no right to do that. And where was the outrage there? It just wasn't there. And you see it by people justifying situations. You know, with George Floyd, all I hear about is that, well, he was using drugs. Well, he did this. Well, he did that. I don't care. I don't care what he did. There is no justification to crush a man's neck and back like that. And to hear the justifications of, well, he was a criminal, he did this, and ironically, it's coming from people that I know did drugs in their past. Okay, I know that they are in no position to throw the first stone, and yet they are so judgmental. When you can look at this injustice and not do anything, and are more concerned about athletes kneeling at the national anthem than you are about the reasons why. And so again, society has to allow this type of institutional systemic racism to continue. If we stood up and said no, enough, it would end. It would end because we would force because this is not a dictatorship yet. We might be getting there, but we're not there yet. But if the people would stand up and say no, instead of just one group, but unfortunately it's all politicized, and you feel like, well, if I support, Black Lives Matter, there's some people in there that have some Marxist ideology. I don't want to be tagged with that. And they find ways to justify, to allow these actions to continue. And so that is the most obvious way. And to say that, the Civil War was over, slavery's over, there's no effects of that. You look at, you look at the history of this, and you think of, it doesn't matter what happened today. If you spent 4 generations living in a ghetto with a lousy education system, which, by the way, is funded by property taxes, so the more wealthy your community, the better schools you have. I don't know who came up with that idea, but it creates this inequity. And when you have generations like that, you think about, if you're the first person in your family to go to college, that's a big deal. And where, if you come from a family where, yes, 5 generations back, you've been going to Harvard, or, we've had these opportunities. When you look at it, that it is systemic, it is generational, because when you start in a bad place and you're born into a bad place, then it sets you at a disadvantage. And I know that I struggle. I came from a poor working class family. No, my stepfather had high school degree. My mother, same thing, worked at factories, worked the docks, and I had issues. But I also know, I asked myself one question: if I was a Black man, would I have had a more difficult time? And it's absolutely yes. And so just because it doesn't negate your own struggles. And I think, a lot of people I talk to that have this sort of societal racist attitudes, they feel that way. Well, I struggled too, and I overcame it, or I did this or that. Well, that's fine, but that doesn't take away that as a person of color in this country, you are profiled in certain jurisdictions. You are going to have greater problems, and it's not just, unfortunately, an antiquated attitude.
Thank you, Aaron. And hearing you again, I thank you for your honesty and your own personal experience and examples you gave. That's absolutely correct. Everybody struggles, but what you're saying is that some for Black people, there is an additional barrier that is not faced by whites. Well, let me ask you a question, Dr. Jones. You often hear the commentary, that Black people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps and get with it. And like Aaron said, they are lazy, they are not working hard. What is your response to that? Looking at history.
It's extremely false. If we know African-American history, we as a people have always tried to uplift, have always tried to better our condition and our status in life. We were just kept from it. We were laborers during the slave period. And when we were freed, we wanted to integrate. We wanted to find equality, full dignity. We wanted to work. We were promised 40 acres and a mule. And so this idea of Blacks being lazy is just false. We've always wanted to improve our lot, but we have always had to fight against oppression. When 4 million former slaves walked off of plantations, what then began to happen is whites wanting to keep Blacks from being equal with them. And so there were these systematic attempts. Whenever a Black town would become successful, what would happen? You would get a white mob that would go into that area and burn that town down and slaughter the people that were there. And so there have always been these attempts for us to better ourselves and to improve our lot in society. And there have always been these attempts to keep us in our place, to keep us subordinate, because there were whites who took it as a personal affront that a Black person, N-word, would do better than them, better than they in life. And so there was always, when we tried to advance ourselves, a backlash to keep us down and in our place.
Absolutely. Let's touch base with our audience and hear what people are saying. Eric, hi, Eric. Williams says it's time to get uncomfortable. Absolutely. And Michelle, hi, Michelle. She says, if you are uncomfortable, then you need to ask yourself why. And that's what we're doing today. Again, folks, these discussions are going to happen every month on the first Sunday of the month. And we went all the way back to the beginning to start at the beginning point, so that as you track with us, we can unravel this conversation and hopefully bring solutions and resolution, bring things out into the open, expose them. And so again, the sunlight and of God's love and mercy and grace can get to those areas and bring healing. And Michelle is absolutely right. If this makes you extreme, obviously it makes us uncomfortable to some degree, but if it makes you uncomfortable to where you think we shouldn't talk about it, we should cover it up, that's a problem. You should ask yourself why. Cynthia, hi, Cynthia Ladi, she says, how can two work together if they do not agree? They must come together as believers. Agreement that racism is wrong. Yes, I think that's what you're hearing, a violent agreement between Daryl and Aaron that this is wrong. This is wrong. And you have my complete agreement as well. And many of those who are listening to us today agree as well. Racism, as that judge put it, is atrocious, it's wicked, it's abominable, and it is false. Right. Lewis, hi, Lewis says, MLK said riots is the voice of the voiceless, referring to Aaron's comments. Absolutely. I think if people think that they can be heard, again, I don't think anybody here is excusing looting. But again, the point that Aaron made is some people, the attitude was like, well, maybe this would have been okay. I would have cared about this, except that they stole all this pair of jeans and they stole that, shoes. I would have cared about that Black man being killed, but now look at what they did. They just stole a pair of jeans. Again, it doesn't make the looting right. Looting is wrong, and we condemn that. But using that as an excuse to overlook the fact that a Black man was just killed, was just murdered in the streets, is really, like Aaron said, is evidence of societal racism. People are always looking for a way to deflect and they grab at whatever is available as a cover screen for the deflection. Lola says, yes, police abused people of color much more than they abuse white people. Plus, Black men do much more longer jail time. The white men who did the same crime than the white men who did the same crime. So there is no equal justice. I don't know if you have a commentary there, Aaron and Dr. Jones.
Well, from the legal perspective, I've been studying this for years, and again, I teach legal history, and I look at the just the case history and then the statistics of incarceration, and it's absolutely correct that as a minority, if you go before a judge, you have a higher risk of a stronger sentence than if you're not. And when you look at the history of the cases in this country, it is definitely weighted, and unfortunately it's not just isolated to the African American community. That there's one particular notorious case where a judge threw out the testimony of 21 Chinese witnesses because he said that Chinese cannot be trusted and they therefore cannot give testimony in court. This attitude of superiority, again, the Supreme Court justice, the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court said the white race is superior, and nobody's disputing that. And so it is definitely, the justice system is definitely weighted. And not only that, but because of minorities, there's a higher percentage of minorities in poverty and lower income. And that in and of itself is discriminatory because you have less access to things. I've seen communities being taken advantage of because they don't have political power. They don't have the ability to influence the vote or things like that, just simply because they're not in a position of power. And the thing I keep coming to is that Jesus emphasized that we need to take care of everybody, that the people in power did not have any hold on Jesus. He did not leave the crowds to go placate the authorities. He ministered to the people who were in need. And by ignoring those who don't have the power, they do get frustrated. They do end up like Lewis's comment that, it may turn into rioting because you're not listening.
Thank you, Aaron. And Dr. Jones, I do have a question from you from Desi. Hi, Bishop Desi. He says, how can we then get our Christian brothers and sisters to have a solution-driven conversation and to stop them from diverting the conversation to something else because they don't want to talk about it?
By putting together something just like this that we're doing. We just have to put this in front of people to see, not allow these issues to be swept under the rug. As I was thinking about what would be the solution to this, I know one thing is not for us just to hold hands and kumbaya and think that this is going to be solved. But I think what will do it is the truth. And I think this is what Desi is getting at. We have to, it's the truth that is going to set us free, not to sweep anything under the rug, but it's the truth. It's our love for the truth and our reaction to the truth, which is going to help us to heal this very deep and difficult problem. So we just have to keep this in front of people. We have to approach it in a reconciliatory kind of way, not condemning, not looking to find fault, but we have to be honest about it. It's not pretty.
Yep.
But we have to be honest with and face the truth.
Absolutely. It's to speak the truth in love. And on that point, I will encourage you, if you're watching us today, share this video. There are so many people who would not want this to go out. Share this video so that people can hear, they can be educated. That's the only way. Listen, this is our weapons as Christians that we're deploying. Because if we don't do what Jesus told us to do, the world would deploy their weapons, and their weapons are hateful and destructive. So help get this, engage this conversation, Bishop Desi and everybody else, by sharing this video so that others can get engaged in this conversation. Simone, hi. Simone says, it is important to know the origins of racism that were embedded into this country's history. Unfortunately, many generations do not know that the founding fathers perpetuated racism, and as a result, it is still existing here today. Aaron, I don't know if you have a comment there.
One of the things that I also see of why so many people are rejecting it, to go back to what Dr. Jones said about truth, this is the truth. This is how it happened. I'm not making this stuff up. This is documented. This is the truth. So let's deal with it. Yeah. You don't have to hate the country to acknowledge its sins.
That's right.
And I think that so many of them are so afraid to acknowledge the sin because then they think they got to throw the country under the bus. This is at least a country where we're able to talk about these things and we are able to make a change, but we've got to get up and do something. Like Dr. Jones said, you just can't stand around and hold hands. You got to do something. And we have it in our power to do it, but you've got to acknowledge that, hey, this is how it was. This is how it is. And so what can we do about it?
Thank you. Is that guilt, that false guilt from the enemy? That's what it is. Afraid that if I somehow, maybe it's some sort of, I'm not patriotic, or maybe I'm, no, that's wrong. We can acknowledge the truth and still love God and love the United States of America. Regardless of all these problems, the US is still the greatest nation on the face of the earth. So we can love this nation, yes. and we can make it better. I believe in making it better any day. Cynthia says that white brother is real. Praise the Lord. This white brother is definitely real. And Pastor Kweku says empathy is the key. We need a pure kind of empathy that is raceless, that accepts and understands the frailties and weaknesses that all people share. Yes, absolutely. We need a raceless empathy that identifies with people at their humanity, not at their race level. I don't know if you have any comments
right
there.
Gloria, if I might, but our special responsibility falls to those who are in power and are in a position to exercise that power. Empathy has to come from them. If they hear people saying "I hurt," then they have to pay attention to that. You can't leave masses of people trapped at the bottom in conditions that others don't want to spend 24 hours in, and don't expect that there's going to be bitterness and anger and people act out. And so the empathy has to come, the compassion really has to come from those who are in power.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. We are running out of time. I'm going to get through this quickly. Michelle says it's still very prevalent, especially in the workplace. I think referring to racism, it is still, unfortunately, very prevalent. And Eric says, what makes people of color so offensive to others?
Yeah, can I have a comment on that? Because I've asked myself that same question. How many times? Why is that? And I think at the core, I think all as human beings, we have the tendency to be a little xenophobic, which means that you're afraid of what you don't know. You're afraid of what's different, and we have somehow I say for my race, a lot of us believe that because it's different, it's a threat to our culture. It's a threat to our way of life. I remember I was a teenager in the 80s, and I remember listening to, I got a Houdini cassette, okay? They were old school rappers. And my mother was just, she was not happy about that because there was this fear that, somehow the mixing of cultures going to annihilate our own. And it's not. We should embrace other people's culture, but I think at its core is that we allow that xenophobia that is somewhat natural in our fallen state to then translate that into fear, and it's fear of something that's different than us.
Yes. Go ahead, Dr. Jones.
Skin color is tied and triggers stereotypes of thinking. So you see a Black man, that'll trigger certain stereotypes in one's mind. You see an Asian person, it'll trigger certain stereotypes in someone's mind, and you can kind of go down the list. But that's why Dr. King said, don't judge me by the color of my skin, but the content of my character. Let your eyes go deeper than skin color, what is on the surface. But I think that's the problem. Skin color is tied to certain kind of thinking.
Thank you. And it does that because of condition, because of what people are taught. And that's where that comes from. I will never forget, I debated whether to tell this story. A colleague of mine at work several years ago had that stereotypical thinking, and she was coming out of the mall, and she saw a group of Black kids, with their pants hanging down, with the dreadlocks, and she kind of steered away from them because she thought that, these were the people who wanted to attack her. It was during the Christmas season in the dark. And so she went to her car. There was another group of all American, white kids, and she thought those were, her kind and would be nice to her. Unfortunately for her, she got to her car. It was those all American, kids that actually came after her. And the group that she thought, the Black kids that she thought would attack her, ran to her rescue. And she felt compelled to share the story at work. And it was really, for her, it was life-changing because she would never have thought that would have been the outcome, that she would have been rescued by the group that she was so afraid of. All right, we need to round up here. Lola says, run for public office. That's her advice of how to stop this. Run for public office so that you can be in a place to make laws. Lola, I think that's a really good idea. Yvette Aiken says, the legacy of slavery has affected the progress of African Americans, and we haven't made progress toward racial equality. And Louis says, cultural conditioning, meaning that that's really why being, the Black person of people of color are sometimes just, offensive to others. And he says it's cultural conditioning. And Simone says there have been many racism barriers broken down, but institutionalized racism has hindered the advancements of African Americans as a race. Yes, some African Americans have experienced success, but many still are experiencing barriers. And we can go on. Eric says exactly, some are afraid of the truth. And what was their skin color in antiquity? And Joyce, hi Joyce, Joyce Enza must. Joyce says people in power also don't like to give that position up. If things are to really change, those in power positions need to humble themselves and listen and then force change. We are going to stop here because we are completely out of time, but I wanted to thank you all so much for our friends on Facebook, for your engagement, for your comments and your questions. As we round up, I would ask you again, share these videos, let people hear, let people be engaged. That's the only way to change hearts and minds, to help people challenge themselves from what they hear today.